who are you doing it for? Are you doing it for an audience? Or are you doing it for yourself? And I do a lot for an audience, but in this case, I do it for myself.
Yes. I've not talked yet today. This is my first. These are the first sort of words I'm uttering. So just kind of easing into that.
And I have a guest, so I've been talking kind of abrasively more than I normally would in the mornings.
So it started with islands first. So I was visiting the Hebridean Islands, 3-4 years ago, just for fun. Just to see, I thought I really want to explore the British Isles. I've spent my whole youth trying to get away from British culture, UK culture, because obviously Scotland isn't the same as English, but travelled to the Hebrides, totally fell in love, primarily with the colour of the place, because I'm a photographer, so the colour of the place is like the way that the light up there, the cold northern sky, interacts with the cold Atlantic and the rainbows and the northern lights and all of the volcanic basalt cliffs. It's just a real colourful place that is constantly changing. So anyway, long story short, got obsessed with islands through the Hebrides. Needed to pursue a project for my master's dissertation, decided to do it on islands and relationality, because I've been doing a lot of work on kinship and relation and animism. Islands, it turns out, are places where lots of questions around relation really come to the fore. So I went there. I've as I say, been there for the last 3 or 4 years, sort of living there on and off, sailing around between them, which is actually a really important aspect of islands, is the ocean.
Do you sail?
I'm an aspiring sailor.
Wow.
I'm doing my competent crew course in Feb, so I'll be a competent crew member, but I won't be a skipper.
I like that there's a process to become a competent. Yeah,
sort of passable, not gonna die. Keep yourself alive is the aim.
Is there a lower rung for kind of the incompetence and then you transcend to competent, or is it just you're not part of it until you're competent?
I think the default is that it's assumed that I'm incompetent. I mean, if you put me, I've sort of picked up bits and pieces sailing around. The sailing trips that I do, you get taught to be a crew member and you have a function and you know what rope to pull and how to sort of steer a little bit, and that thing's a sail. But yeah, you learn much more in-depth stuff about the wind, and it's quite physicsy, and you learn a bit about meteorology.
I imagine that eventually becomes intuitive once you've been doing it for a long time, that you're feeling it as much as you're making calculations based on directions, right?
Yeah, definitely. When you watch a really good skipper, they'll impress you with their kind of technical knowledge, but they're using that in unison with a deep intimacy with the landscape and the wind, and looking at the wind. I look at the ocean and some clouds and I'm like, oh, maybe the wind's coming from that direction, but the skipper will be like, the wind's going to do this in 2 hours and from this direction, from this celestial body is going to impact this thing, and this whale is going to do this. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm not seeing any of this. So it's super impressive.
Wow. And that close reading the landscape
must be knowledge that then kind of stays with you in other contexts and can just inform the way you move through the world off the boat as well.
Yeah, what's interesting about it is kind of what I was just talking about the art and academia thing, is that sailing is a perfect example of a place where you can be deeply in the logos and deeply in the mythos at the same time, and you don't have to throw one out for the other to exist, because sailing a boat is a very precise technical instrument that relies on precision engineering and mathematics. And then also, as we just said, you've got the mythos of the landscape and the intimacy with nature and all of the poetry that comes with that, but it's all in one. There's no there's no choosing, which is so rich and fulfilling, and everybody needs to go sailing. It's so good.
Actually, just thinking about the sailors that I know and the skippers that I know, they're probably the least conditioned people that I know as well, the least kind of socially conditioned people.
I
Yeah.
wonder if that is something also to do with just a return to the fundamentals of what's important, because obviously staying alive when you're on a boat there's a lot more kind of practical skill involved in doing that, and then other things I imagine fade into the background relatively, or
Yeah.
become
Yeah.
more prominent, depending on what
Well-
headspace they allow in.
Well, so like if you've been at sea for like however long you've been at sea, apart from like some parts of the boat, you've not seen like a straight line for a long time.
No, this is it. It's like,
Wild.
it is wild, you know, and you've got all of this kind of cartography and sailing charts and things that are, again, depend on lines and depend on like slicing up the landscape. And it is, you know, it's done in grids, like longitude, latitude, that kind of thing. But when you're out there, it's, you know, you can get to certain points on the planet where you can see the curvature of the Earth in open ocean. It's just, yeah, it puts you into a completely different space, like headspace. Your whole perception just, yeah, changes and morphs.
Do you find
Wonderful.
yourself sort of craving that as you're getting more into sailing?
Definitely. It's sailing for me. If I had to put one word onto it, which I kind of don't want to be reductionist about it, but if someone says, okay, you know, what does sailing mean to you? I immediately think of freedom, because it's, you know, when you're out, especially open ocean or like large expanses of water where you're kind of, I don't know, 50 to 100 miles away from the coast, things like taxes and advertisements and social media, like algorithms, become very abstract, because what's right in front of you is your survival, which sounds kind of intense and dark, but it's actually not. It forces you to be alive, and it just feels so freeing.
Which is also interesting because in another way, you couldn't be less free in physical space than when you're on a boat. Like you know, you have this few meters or however big it is, right? That you can exist in. I mean, obviously that's a different angle on freedom.
You're so right, though. I think on the boat that I sail on, with Sail Britain, you've got 9 people in a 42-foot yacht that has you're basically sleeping in like coffins with 9 strangers. It's a recipe for disaster. It's like horrendous, especially if you're an introvert like me. But for some reason, each time I've done it, it's been profound. The crew dynamics and the way that people move together in space and naturally learn without any conversation about, oh, you need to be there, or it just clicks. Things sort of slot.
Well, also, if you're an introvert but you find yourself in a place where you have to be around people for a certain amount of time, it's fine, because that's the option that you have. I find anyway, like it's the choice that defines the introversion to some degree.
The reason why I find sort of group dynamics on a boat particularly fascinating is because I've been in a lot of environments where group dynamics are really amplified. So like retreats to do with, you know, conscious relating, and psychedelic retreats, and Vipassana, and all sorts of other really confronting intimate group settings that seem to always fall apart because of some drama or a power grab, or intentional communities, you know, is a good example. But on the boat, where you think, oh, well, in that case, this is an absolute nightmare, the opposite thing happens, because of the proximity of essentially death all around, the potential for death. People do not play games. Generally, the stakes are very high. There's no back door. The only back door is, well, you can be thrown overboard or jump ship or whatever. No one wants that. So I just find that people seem to mature a lot in that environment and treat each other with a lot more respect.
I wonder if there's a parallel there to, certain maybe indigenous communities, where the kind of small communities where there isn't an option to go anywhere else. Like, those are the people you're going to see for.
And interrelated with those interpersonal dynamics, I guess there's also the same thing of the survival depends on everyone playing their part in this co-created ecosystem where you're competent and kind of not distracted by social media or by arguing with one of the other ones.
Yeah. It's like a boat is often used as a metaphor for an island. So there's another parallel there with the island's fascination. And I think it was Plato who said that he came up with this metaphor called the ship of state, which basically said that democracy formed on ships because of the way that ships force you to relate with each other in a special way. And islands are very much the same. It depends on we live in the British Isles. I live in the British Isles, technically an islander. I don't identify as an islander necessarily, but islands, because of their clear boundedness and their limiting factors, they create some of the same conditions as a boat would do on a group.
That's an aspect of your work I've been really curious about, actually, is what size of island relates to the feeling of being an islander? Where do you think we lost it with Britain, and kind of what do you think goes on with, obviously there's the whole history of kind of Britain roaming far beyond its bounds, going around the world, feeling this intense need to travel across land and sea, and all the history that's resulted from that. But do you think there's anything there to do with the islandness of Britain, but just kind of being a bit too big to really make something of itself where it is, but then still maybe taking on some intrepid qualities from what islandness would be? And it's a really clunkily expressed question, but something that's in my mind.
It makes total sense. Yes, it has. I wrote about this in my dissertation, actually quite a lot. It was about how metaphors of islandness and scale and how they sort of stretch and compact. And for me personally, my sense of islandness, of being on an island, of feeling like I'm on an island, is, can I see the ocean? And an island that I've spent a decent chunk of time on is the Isle of Iona in the Hebrides, and that's 3 miles long. And you can walk up and down it and around it in, half a day, less than, and you look, wherever you look, there's the ocean, sort of reminding you, oh, you're on an island. Whereas, I'm currently sat in a house near Paddington Station in London, sort of what ocean, what island? I can't hear the sort of ocean wind. I can't hear the waves crashing. I can't see the horizon. So I think the size definitely does matter. And this idea of islandness anyway is very, very subjective, but anecdotally speaking, a lot of people share that kind of view. That said, Australia is a continent, technically speaking, but I know lots of Australians who consider themselves islanders because of the way Australia is sort of its own thing in the ocean. So it mixes a lot, this idea, which is fascinating.
This isn't as much about islands, but just more about this idea of being able to see the sea. I find it changes my perception of time quite a lot, or anywhere that's on the coast. People relate to time in a different way. This is completely anecdotal, but it seems that people are a little bit more in the present. It's a little bit less planning and structure.
No, it's totally a thing. Island life, particularly on smaller islands, is dictated by the weather, which changes your experience of time. So, there are some times where you can't get off of an island because the ferries are off because there's a gale, and then it feels drawn out. It's interesting the way islands are sort of represented in kind of popular culture and the way it interacts with time as well. Like Robinson Crusoe is one of like the core examples of, you know, being the island becoming this sort of prison where time feels infinite and you feel sort of stuck. Whereas other islands are kind of represented as disappearing and ephemeral, and you land on them for a second and you live a whole life there. But it's almost kind of how a psychedelic experience in some ways, because you go in for 15 minutes and you're like, I'm 80 years old now, on the other end, and then you come out and you're like, how long was I in there? Where I've spent most of my time is the Isle of Gometra, and it has no ferry, no electricity, no hot running water. It's completely off grid. It takes 2 ferries and a 4-hour walk across another island next door to get to it. And then, when you get to it after this walk, you're kind of like, have a nice hot bath or whatever. You can't have that. And so you're just in, it's really confronting. For me, it takes about a week to shed off all of my civilizedness and accept that, okay, I'm going to be kind of dirty now for a while, or I'll take a bird bath or whatever. So that version of island life, is very different to the island escape, desert island thing.
Is that the one I was reading your dissertation? Is that the one where there's 4 inhabitants or 4 full-time in
Yeah, that's right. I was interested in it because I really love maps, and I'm an OS Maps premium subscriber, which is a bit nerdy. But anyway, they've got this map. They've got multiple ways you can view this map in this app. And when you go on this special, it's called Premium Topo or something. You go on it and you zoom in, you can see all of this minutiae, stuff that isn't marked on normal maps, definitely not on Google Maps, like burial mounds, old forts, sacred sites, old settlements, really cool, interesting stuff. And I found with Gometra that it wouldn't actually show up on the map unless you zoomed in to a certain level, which is really weird because it's not a tiny island. It's decent size. I thought, what's on this island? And what really interested me about it as well was it was kind of at the end of its archipelago. And from Gometra, you have this 180 perspective on all of the surrounding islands. So you're really looking out into the Atlantic and just seeing island like that. And your view isn't clouded by Ulva or Mull or any of the bigger islands that you have to cross to get to it. So I was just like, what's on this island? And I found out about the owner, and he's also wildly interesting. Co-founded Ocean Rebellion, is a writer. I thought, okay, I'm going to this island.
How did you feel about drawing awareness to it in the work that you've been doing on it?
Not necessarily too bad, because the owner, Rock, has done a BBC documentary on it with Stacey Dooley, where she goes around, and it's really fascinating. You definitely watch it. She goes around to people living sort of unconventional lives, and she went there to film obviously quite a mainstream thing for telly that was, just exploring what it was like to live off grid on a remote island. And I put that in quotes because a lot of islanders really, really despise the word remote, because it's remote from what? Remote from, the epicenter of commerce or Westminster, or
we're here. This is the center of my world. What?
Exactly. Yeah. I guess the draw in modernity is more and more people are being compacted into cities, and people, populations are less spread out, and people are becoming more codependent on mainland services, and for that reason, as this centralization continues, governments and councils are not funding remote island communities or mountain villages because they just don't see the point. They don't think they're going to get return on investment, and quite often the kind of pattern of island life is that the younger generation, especially now with the internet, wants to go to the big city, so they leave, and there's a population drain, brain drain, or whatever you want to call it. Although now in recent times, in the past few years, it seems it's reversing, so that kind of millennials who want children to raise families are going back to islands and trying to revive island cultures and communities because they can see the value of being in a place like that. But it's not easy, obviously. It's like huge considerations around childcare, healthcare, work. Like a lot of islanders work online, and they also do crofting, fishing. So they've got one foot in, island tradition, and then one foot in like a tech startup on the other side of the world or whatever it is, which is great.
This is a topic shift. Something I really wanted to ask you about. It must have been 3 years ago that I last saw you, and I remember you were in the process of starting to share poetry on social media, but things that hadn't been polished, and you were trying to get over perfectionism. And I remember just being really amazed, like, wow, like I could never just write a poem and just like share it it was unbelievable to me.
I unfortunately haven't conquered the perfectionism or the kind of anxiety that comes with sharing, but I have my sort of technique or the way I would trick myself into doing this was so because I'm a photographer, I would always pair it with an image that gave me like an anchor. So the poem wasn't just this abstract thing. I'm a very sort of visual person. I look at the image that I've taken, and I've obviously taken the image for a specific reason. And I look in the image to see, are there any metaphors in there? What's the image saying to me? And then the poem comes, which sounds like quite a sort of abstracted way to do it, but I always write the poem in place. So I'll be on a beach or on a mountain or whatever, take the picture, and then I'll just sit there and then write. And I won't adhere to any form, no like stanzas, iambic, pentameter. My poems are like super, super simple.
You write it at the time you've taken the picture, not looking at the picture later?
No, unless I don't know if I've actually ever edited any of my poems. So I kind of, I do it there. So it feels more, to me, it feels more alive that way. And then as soon as I get internet connection, I just post it. And I'm like, it's out there. It's, even if it's like super, super cringe, it's just out there. And I'll often write it directly into the Instagram caption, or whatever platform. I won't write it on notes. I won't write it on paper. I'll just put it out there, which kind of diminishes part of the sort of, or like maybe devalues the romance around poetry, but it's the only way I'll do it.
There's an incredible directness to that. I mean, in some ways it kind of strips away a lot of the artistry, which I guess is actually mediation that's coming between you and these things. That I love the metaphor of the anchor that you used at the beginning there, just to have this kind of direct correspondence between the place as you perceived it in the moment you perceived it and then what comes out. So the minimalism of that process seems really beautifully suited. How did you get to the point at which you were ready to take the plunge and share the things in the first? Because it seems like a kind of bravery that like gets easier to do over and over again, but how did you get there the first time?
It's got something to do with, I've got a thing about authenticity. Authenticity is a very big word, and like quite often the people who are most obsessed with authenticity are the least authentic. And I don't know if I'm actually that person, but if I create something, I know if it's authentic, or to me, I just know. We all know. And when I use that sort of method, I suppose you could call it, I know it's authentic even if it's trash, because it can only be real because I haven't analysed it, I haven't edited it, I haven't, does that make sense? It's not quite an answer to your question, but it's, and it's, who are you doing it for? Are you doing it for an audience? Are you doing it for yourself? And I do a lot for an audience, but in this case, I do it for myself because I know in that process and in the poetic form that, again, like I said about fiction earlier, there's a kind of spiritual key for me, like something that's important to my development in doing that. I wish I could apply this logic to all of the other things that I share online. I don't. I completely overanalyze and edit them.
But do you always see it through to the end? If you start that ritual of, okay, I've taken a photo and I'm going to share it, you always see it through?
Unless nothing comes.
Okay.
Like, I'm trying to think of,
But the
if
point is,
I,
I'm not saying like, this is rubbish, so I'm not going to share it. The point is like, even if it's trash,
yeah.
it goes.
And surprisingly, I mean, people might disagree with me, but usually they're not rubbish. But, well, they're not like professional poems, but I feel like they're not rubbish. Otherwise, I would, I would feel a bit cringed and embarrassed. Some of them are less good, but it's this, if I go out to the beach or wherever it is, usually at the shoreline writing poems, with the intention that I'm going to write a poem, I usually can't do it. Because it's already, I'm like, but my last one was quite good and it will never be as good as that. Or my last one was really bad and I don't, the inner critic comes. Whereas what happens if I'm just like freely living, I find that these things, I would just call it, it's all metaphor to me. It just pops out, and then you grab it. You're like, right, put that in the bag, done.
I get it with like songwriting. If I put like, okay, I'm going to put this thing, I'm going to keep this day free for, to like make a song. It's always rubbish. and then it's when you've got like 45 minutes and like, cause you've got something else to do and you're like, oh God, I think that is just what it is. I don't think it can be any other way.
This is really interesting because I love writing and I also find it really difficult. And a lot of advice from, professional writers is do not wait for the muse, sit down at your desk at 6 a.m. or whatever it is every morning, blank sheet, like I've got now, a blank sheet of paper, pen, just write. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. Like I cannot demand that the muse show up. And then the writer will say, oh, you're being too romantic. It's a craft just like anything else and you need to set the conditions for it. And I'm like, I understand and respect your approach and it might work for you, but it's never worked for me, ever.
I have a slightly different perspective on that one, actually. So I write poetry also, and I completely agree with what both of you were saying about it comes when it comes. Usually for me, it's like getting off a train when I've got 2% battery and the perfect phrase comes and there has to be a way to somehow put it down on something like my coffee cup while moving through a crowd of people, and then just get to the nearest table and get it out then and there, otherwise it will go. But I've been doing the artist's way, which has these morning, you look like you know what I'm talking about.
Love it.
And what I found is the pages very, very clearly and quickly come to feel like detritus that gets cleared away, and then whatever happens in the rest of the day happens, and a poem might come, it might not, more often than not it doesn't, but when it comes, it is less likely to contain the detritus that has been cleared by doing the writing in the morning. So I don't know if that's what other people mean when they say just get up and write, but I feel like it's get up and basically word vomit, and then you won't have to involve those words or those thoughts and those tangles and the other stuff.
Is the artist's way just writing? Is it a writing thing?
It's writing every day in the morning, and then week by week there's other challenges that you do.
But it's centered around authorship, like words. It's centered around like
it's centered around words and images. So you have the morning pages, which you do every day, and then you have the artist's date, which is where you do a fun thing for yourself, by yourself for 2 hours once a week, where essentially you're filling your well with new images. So I guess water imagery again, which kind of fits the themes of creativity that you talk about in your dissertation as well, this kind of idea of like porousness and the natural shapes of water and ideas bleeding between spaces. But yeah, just non-specific filling of this well with stuff that then might come up in alternative ways.
I used to do it. I did it for about a year, and I found it completely generative. And I love that book as well. And annoyingly, even though I know it is incredibly effective, I stopped doing it. But you've just reminded me that I should start, not should, but I may start doing it again, because it is really that advice of sit down at 6 and write kind of thing is like, if you're trying to write a novel or something, it becomes this huge analytical task of like, what character is here and plot and things like that. Whereas if you're just doing, as you say, like word vomit, it's not something that, we're told we're allowed to do in this culture. Like, everything we do has to be the best thing we've ever done, and it has to be like so presentable. And it's like, no, that it's so deep in my bones, the kind of meritocracy around that. So yeah, I mean, morning pages are really, really effective, I think.
Is it strict about 6 a.m. or is that part optional?
I hadn't heard about that part, but I take it you're a very early morning person.
Not at all. I mean, I think the 6 a.m. thing, it tags onto the productivity guru stuff, because a lot of productivity gurus cottoned on to the artist way and were like, oh, another hack. Let's incorporate this into our 5 a.m. ice bath.
I hate the whole thing, like, with a passion. I've never talked about how much I hate it.
Me too.
It's just awful. The sort of like dividing your. I've also come from a state of mind. I used to be very, very obsessed with the time and could literally tell you the time to the nearest 2 minutes at any point of the day.
Wow.
It was just really just like, but I wasn't like never in the present, just always in this like meta structure of thinking about the next thing I was going to do. And I'll talk to that friend, but only for 20 minutes because I need to read that article, but then that will take this much time. And not even trying to do it, it would just impose itself. And sort of like put so much effort into. I'm not very good at timekeeping anymore, and I'm so thrilled about it. I'm just over the moon about it. So just everything I see about this sort of like using time, it just makes me incredibly angry, because I think it's a miserable existence if you're using time that effectively. Like, you're not in the present.
Well, I mean, it says a lot that there's hardly any clocks in Las Vegas because they want people to be in the present, enjoying the moment, so that in order to create this kind of hyper commercial spending world that people can really lose themselves in, the time is absent from the conscious experience there. And I guess also absent in its regular sense with seconds and minutes on the island, but it must have occurred to you to follow time in so many different ways that are outside what we experience in cities.
Yeah, definitely. And there's not you don't look at the time on boats either. You don't you don't have miles per hour as well, which is what I find interesting. That you have knots, but as far as I'm aware, and my sailing friends might disagree with me, that it's not knots per hour. Yeah, well, maybe it is. I don't know, but you're not sort of tracking distance against time in the same way. Or maybe I'm just like a really lazy crew member, and I just am like, oh, la, la, la. And everyone else is like clock watching.
Slightly off topic, but it's in boats. I was curious about this before. You mentioned Vipassana, and many of these conscious communities, there's quite a set kind of when we will talk and when we won't talk. But on a boat, how much do you instinctively kind of have conversations versus respect the silence and of the noise of the place without human conversation in it? And like, is there ever music? Like, how do you decide? I'm just thinking about a dolphin ride I once went to commune with the dolphins, but I'm a Barbie girl was playing in a loop on the background, and so yeah, curious about sonic things and interpersonal dynamics around sound.
It has to be Barbie girl. That's every day. That's
that's funny, because I made a promotional video for a sailing trip I'm doing next August the other day and put it on Instagram, and I was trying to fit like this epic sailing video. I was like, what music do I put to this sailing video? And I tried loads of different stuff. And it was all epic sea shanty stuff, and I was like, no, this is too cliche, I can't do this. And I ended up on Gimme, Gimme, Gimme by ABBA. There's something in that song that feels like an expedition. Like, you feel like you're journeying and it's epic, but it's also fun. It's not kind of cringe epic. It's like funky epic or something. Anyway, it worked really well with the video.
Amazing. Well, I'm a big ABBA fan, so I'm I always had a dream where I was talking to one of the members of ABBA. She was giving me some really, really solid advice.
Was it pre-music production, or was it?
No, I just started producing music, and I just started like trying to record my voice, and then ABBA, the
really
the
timely.
blonde, the blonde. What's she called? Agnes. She came to me in a dream, and she said, "Record your vocal line, and then sort of duplicate it and pitch it down a little bit, so then your voice doubled, but a slightly different tone." I must have seen this on a documentary at some point and not remembered, because apparently this is a thing that ABBA actually did, or someone had told me about it. But she explained this in a dream to me in a toilet, and it's very effective.
Dreams are good like that, aren't they? I had one years ago. I must have been 15 or 16 or 17. Do you know the film The Curious Case of Benjamin Button? Where he ages backwards or something. There's a scene in that film where they're on a boat, funnily enough. I had actually had 3 nights recurring. I had a dream that I was on the boat in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and we were in a storm, and I knew everything about sailing. I knew every technical term for the parts of the boats and how, every maneuver. This knowledge just implanted in my brain. And on the 3rd night of my crazy Curious Case of Benjamin Button dream thing, I was sleepwalking around the house shouting nautical commands to a crew that was in my dream. My parents were like, "Wow, what is going on?" Anyway, weird
How
memory.
Are you prone to sleepwalking anyway?
Not at all. Not at all. Or speaking in my sleep at all. It was just so intense.
Possession or something?
I was possessed, definitely. But forgot all of the knowledge. So I do frequently have sailing dreams of the boat doing sort of weird stuff, like going up mountains, and like sailing around a lake and then just deciding to completely divert and go up the side of a mountain. Or
we were talking about this recently, that very strange trope of dreams where you can be like, oh, I was in the Premier Inn, but it was actually my house, and where it's like you're on a mountain, but we were actually on the beach in Tenerife, but it looked like a mountain.
Yeah, it's this weird kind of atmospheric splicing where you get the connotations of both, and then the kind of proxemic objects that fit with both.
Yeah, and so it doesn't matter what the thing looks like, because there's like an essence because its concept is more overwhelming.
yeah,
or if you're like, oh, it was my friend Georgia, but it was actually my sister. When people appear as other people, it's really curious.
yeah.
That's not even like a trope, because that's also not like a storytelling trope.
Yeah, that mixing of like perception. It's not even perception, but like it's like I mean, you'll know more about phenomenology than me, but it seems to be like a phenomenological, like you called it atmospheric splicing, Ros, and I kind of think it's like a phenomenological kind of like inversions. Senses are becoming inverted and sort of spliced and complicated.
Yeah, you get like phenomenology and ontology sort of like forced together.
Yeah,
what you're experiencing isn't the essence of the thing, and I feel like it maybe in dreams more than in any other states, like you get the idea of like this essence of something in spite of its appearance.
A really interesting one, because obviously there's this slight sense of morphic resonance to all of this, but then with no physical object for the morphic resonance to pertain to, so it's almost like 2 morphic resonances can coexist or more.
Right. And so like different senses are picking up on each one.
yeah.
like the visual aspect, but then your felt sort of tangible sense of where you are.
And exactly, and you can use any of your senses to perceive any of the characteristics that happen to be the ones that come to you, because there's no physical limitation to preclude all of this sensory, like, extrapolation, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like it's making me think of memory, like it's a kind of, it's like the memory of an implied sensation, which is making me think of metaphor. I don't know why. I mean, my head's sort of going wee and making connections, but it's like how memory isn't something that's just in the past, but it's something that's invoked and like repeated and reworked somehow and made present. And
yeah, well, it's storytelling each time, right? It's both to remember something.
do you know Stephen Jenkinson?
Yes.
He's fascinating. He talks about how most people think remembering is a passive act and like nostalgic and is not, necessarily sort of generative or particularly functional. But he talks about remembering is not passive at all. It's an active invocation of something. I think, yeah, that's really good. I think so too.
Well, that comes into John Crow, who runs Crossbones Graveyard, which is a memorial for the outcast dead in London. He talks a lot as well about this same principle of kind of remembering, and the sense of the re-embodiment of the people conjured up in the verse, which feels parallel.
You've just made me think of something which you might be really interested in, which is something I don't know anything about, but something I was talking about the other day with someone who's in my documentary. In Gallic kind of spirituality, I suppose, there's this thing called vertical consciousness. And I think, well, what does that imply? That everybody else is on like a horizontal consciousness? And how does that affect our perception of time? And my friend Vari was talking about it, and I didn't know what it was, but I could feel what it was based on the way that she was describing it. And I was like, I feel very close to something, but not quite, I haven't grasped it, and maybe it's not meant to be grasped. But that's really interesting.
I'd love to hear her explanation.
It will be in the film, hopefully, when it comes out next year at some point.
Can you tell us a bit more about the film?
So it's called Islandness in the Anthropocene, which is a bit of a mouthful. And funders are like, you need to call it something different. And I keep trying to call it something different, but it is what it says on the tin. It's about islands in the time that we're in, which, I don't necessarily think that Anthropocene is the only word. Some people really, really dislike it, but I think it's a good word. Gonna use it. So it's about why the kind of overarching question is, well, what is it about islands that's interesting in this time? And there are many answers to that, which the film is trying to get at, but it's basically that, kind of to simplify it if I can, that island places, ecologies and cultures are reacting in very peculiar ways to some of the damaging effects of modernity. And islands are often known as the canaries in the coal mine, because what happens on islands tends to happen before it gets to mainlands. That's the reason why anthropologists and like climate scientists will usually go to an island first to study, ocean acidification, rising temperatures, yada, yada, yada. And then kind of bring it back to the mainland and say, okay, we've got like 5 years until so-and-so happens. So it's, that's the timeliness of the documentary, is that there's islands that are very important right now in this moment that we're in, and not just in terms of climate, but all of the ways in which these effects which are happening to the place are changing the culture, changing the language, changing people's experience of their own spirituality in relation to the place. There's stuff to do with like commerce and colonialism and language and art and tradition and belonging, and all of these big human questions, basically using islands as a kind of, or not using, but kind of working through islands as a place where these questions are alive and not abstract. I don't know if that explains it.
Yeah. Have you read Huxley's Island?
I haven't. It's on my reading list. I've missed the trick there. There's tons of fascinating literature on islands as well. I'm trying to think of some of the books that I read. I think probably my favourite book that I read in my dissertation research was a book by Edouard Glissant, French Martinican philosopher, called The Poetics of Relation. It's just fascinating. It's quite dense at points, but he basically talks about islands and relation and metaphors for relation and how, we should not perceive ourselves as rooted, but rather as rhizomatic, which is kind of the metaphorical shift from island to archipelago, is that it's not the singular entity, but rather entities in parallel in relation to each other.
Well, I'd never thought about this. Is ridiculous. I'd never thought about this until a few months ago, and I said it to Rose, but it hadn't occurred to me that islands they're not just sort of floating. Like, it's all connected by land, of course, and it's just where the sea levels are, and things become islands because the sea levels rise, and it's incredibly obvious, but I just sort of never put that system together. Because islands they're hills, essentially, aren't they, in the earth?
Yeah, like the tops of mountains, but some of them are, parts you go underwater and you're like, oh my God, it's like the Alps. I'm on top of the Alps.
I just hadn't thought about it before, like because I was thinking, things become islands because there are earthquakes and the land breaks away, or sort of tectonic shifts, and I mean that's a small part of it, but mostly it's water.
And our relationship to the idea of remoteness, which you were saying so many people that live on islands don't like, would presumably shift so much if that conceptualization was more embedded and less something you come to out of reach.
I don't know if we just came to it late or if people...
It's really, I never, I haven't been obsessed with islands my whole life. It's just only in going to the place, I was like, And actually what part of the origin of the obsession is that I love philosophy. I'm not a trained philosopher, but I love being philosophical, and in my sort of environmentalist artist circles, it's quite not being intellectual is kind of looked down on in a lot of ways as a way of being that's not embodied and so on. And so when I got to the islands thing, I was like, hang on, all of my philosophical ideas about paradox especially are lived in this place, and they're tangible and they're real, and I'm stood in them and I'm participating in them. So I can be waxing lyrical about metaphysics and be on an island as embedded as you can get in that environment and saying, well, hang on, the physics and the metaphysics aren't separate. And there's no such thing as this, like, this is intellectual, this is art. And, there is on the level of relativity and, the kind of Buddhist idea of the ultimate and the relative dimension. But I felt very validated in the islands because I thought, yes, I get to be philosophical, and yes, I get to be embodied, whatever that thing is, which I don't agree with necessarily as a concept, or I don't think it's necessarily accurate.
It's only in sort of recent academic traditions where philosophy is seen as this abstracted thing. I think it was always a practice.
That's really interesting. I can't remember her name. It was an island scholar from Polynesia who said, should we make island a verb? And like this idea of islanding, you're like, it's a lived practice, right? You're taking it from the category and the stasis of the concept to...
We should verb everything, though.
Yeah. Yeah.
John Donne would have some objections.
Did he not like verbing?
Well, No Man is an Island, I'm thinking of. I feel like he fought quite viscerally against this idea that you can island yourself, that you're demonstrating so beautifully that so many people are doing in so much of their work.
But it wouldn't work if he'd said, no man is islanding because
No, because people could just prove him wrong.
I write about that in the dissertation, actually, because people often stop at no man is an island, but it continues, no man is an island unto himself. And that is what I argue in the dissertation, the crucial context, because he's not saying that no man is an island at all, rather that no man is an island on his own. It's like, yes, that's the paradox of the individual, because we are individuals / islands, but we're also in relation. And because we're also in a community or an archipelago. I'm just really, smushing the metaphors together. That doesn't therefore, they're not mutually exclusive. It doesn't therefore mean we're not an island or an individual, or, in the essay, I go all the way down to the level of the atom, which I think my supervisor was probably like, what? you're really trying to stretch the scale of this metaphor. But I think that's one of the core arguments, is that island form teaches us, there's island form all the way down and all the way up. It just depends on, what level of perception you're looking at it from. Or, this could all be rubbish and I could just be really shoehorning the metaphor. But I don't think that's the case.
Well, but I think that's really important. I mean, I'll shoehorn away as well, because the point is that, well, the point is many things. A point is that, some narratives have become so dominant in our world and in our media world that we need more metaphorical variety. So shoehorn them in, because everything's metaphors anyway.
Yeah.
Like everything, the way that scientists, explain atoms and things, like it's all just a metaphor for we don't really know, but we can predict the behaviors of these things, but we don't really know what they are fundamentally.
And there's so much to be gained as well, I think, from stretching a metaphor and testing the boundaries of where it breaks, where it works. I think so much metaphor is swallowed unquestioningly and regurgitated, that to really inhabit one and kind of pick through the bones of it and work out where it stands, where it falls, that's a much richer way to engage with the world through metaphor than to just allow it to be kind of prefabricated ones stuck together.
I mean, what you've just said was the purest metaphor. You almost spoke exclusively a metaphor, which is amazing. It's so interesting when you catch yourself, when you get on the other side of your metaphorical consciousness. It's really disarming. Oh my gosh, that's what you're seeing, the sort of logic, I suppose, of your own, the mythic logic, which many people would say is some sort of contradiction of your own consciousness, which is thrilling.
Of course, you did it then. You get on the other side of your metaphors, and it's disarming.
Yeah.
Always metaphors abound.
And that's mythos and logos together again, you brought together to introduce us to the idea of the boat at the beginning, just this really nice coexistence as well.
Yeah, it's interesting when people sort of, I used to be this person, our language is so abstract, language is abstract, what about pre-linguistic consciousness and stuff? The whole of language is based on spatial metaphors of situating oneself in the context and in relation to something else in time. Language comes from embodied life. It doesn't come from out there and down and in. It's not transplanted. It's provoked by embodiment.
Yeah, and it's a limitation in the way that most people conceptualize language. As these kind of abstract labels. But yeah, and then the point about the sort of spatialized thing. There are these examples of cultures, where the past is in front of you and the future is conceptually behind you, because you can't see it, which is perfectly reasonable.
I did a research project with a think tank called Perspectiva years ago, and my then boss sort of said to me, go and find out why metaphor matters. And at this point, my awareness of metaphor was very elementary. It was kind of it's a thing, a literary rhetorical device that Shakespeare sometimes uses. this is what I learned in school. And then I went away, did this research project, and I really destabilized for a while because I got behind myself, as when you step back and you're like, oh gosh, you have this metaphor satori. And it was very liberating and very exciting because I also think that metaphor, let me think about how I would say it, like the island form and archipelagic form, I think I say it at the start of my dissertation, is like metaphor in that for a metaphor to function, you need two islanded concepts that come together in a kind of archipelago, and then you've got the ocean between them. So this is a bit sort of abstract, but then you've got, if the etymology of metaphor is the bearer of the beyond or to carry across, I think, it's like a ship, a metaphor. To get to a good metaphor, you sort of sail from the source domain to the target domain, and you've got this gap between concepts that you transcend or traverse, and then you get to the other side, and this is very convoluted, not very clear, but I kind of know, I can't articulate what I feel in my mind, but maybe you get some sense of where I'm going with it.
Yeah, no, my whole PhD was on metaphors, so I very much understand the madness that comes with, and because also the other aspects of metaphor is that that the two things, or the two destinations, if you will, they become something else together as well. They change one another. I mean, on a larger scale, that would happen with two islands if you put a ferry between them. They're both gonna affect each other in quite radical ways over a longer timescale.
It's like a metaphor is almost, when Gregory Bateson said that metaphor is the logic of the organic world, it took me a while to understand that, but now I can sort of grasp it, where it's like metaphor uses the same kind of blueprint that relationship itself uses, in that two things come together via the space between them to create a third entity that is the metaphor or the baby, or the thing in between. So it's not this empty vacuum. There's something going on there, and that's how relationships work, right? Even if you're not making babies, it's you're creating a we space, which is a bit cringe term, but you're sort of, you know what I mean? It's really interesting.
Yeah, and that wouldn't exist without the shared consciousness and that two-way perception.
Yeah, well, like when you meet someone, or I guess to some degree with everybody, there's like a certain person that you can be, or that you become, or gets unlocked when you come into contact with a particular person. I'm not sure I'm really making a point here.
No, I think codependency is one of those. It's really interestingly unhelpful, but also I can see intended to be useful concept, because of course we're all unlocking aspects of ourselves that we can't without the particular people that are the special people in our lives, or the not so special people in our lives that like create our sense of self by all these selves that they unlock, that together form who we are. So the idea of being in relationship without that dynamic is, so it's a very slippery slope from that to then needing other people in order to have any sense of self, which I guess is when the idea of codependency comes in. But also that's maybe still what is going on, even when it's not being kind of cast in this really unhealthy light in a kind of particular therapy dynamic.
I think it would be hard to have any sense of self if you weren't in relationship with anybody else. That would be, makes no sense to me.
Yeah, totally. I love this phrase that comes from neurobiologist Francisco Varela. He talks about things in relation mutually engender each other. It's a lovely sort of when I read that phrase, I was like, yeah, that's really it. You mutually engender each other. You help each other sort of cultivate your individual identity, which kind of contradicts on some level the very idea of the individual as this like sort of insular, private thing, which is great. Which is like, you know, it's something I've written about quite a lot and have been harping on about for ages, about this idea of the paradox of the individual, is that you're both an individual and you're in community at the same time, and it's impossible to be extracted from either and be able to be alive or somehow exist. And that's again, it's like we arrive at a paradox. And I just think that's fascinating.
I think it's really problematic, the whole, not entirely, I think the extent to which it goes is problematic. This whole like know yourself and like find out who you are. I think it's kind of like rammed down our throats culturally, and it's just like know ourselves in what context.
It's so context dependent. And counterculture only is counterculture in relation to the existence of culture. Like, so actually, broadly speaking, it's all culture.
And especially this whole like isolating yourself to get to know, like, I understand taking time and like you know, understanding experiences that you've had, but I think it's often not framed like that, and I don't think you can. I don't think you can know yourself if you're not actually letting anybody in some kind of intimate way.
And I mean, I guess it connects to this idea of identity being something that we have that's walled off, and that actually, you know, so identity is this rigid thing that we have to cultivate, and we project symbols and metaphors and subcultures and all sorts of stuff and fashions and whatnot to signal to others that this is my perimeter. This is me signaling my identity. This is my boundary. Whereas actually, identity is completely porous and is always changing. And if you're someone that, you know, is aware of your identity as such, it's really frustrating when it constantly changes, and then people will try and hold you to account to your previous self and say, you've changed. I'm like, well, that's the nature of the universe. You know, change is the only rule that exists in this universe.
Because it's in some ways it's the only thing that can be depended upon is mutability.
Which is why, you know, linking it back to islands as well is why I find it so interesting, because I feel like I've learned a lot about identity through islands, and the way that the tides rise and things come ashore and they change the identity of the landscape and things leave. And you know, in Iceland they have this like birthing ritual when a volcano erupts and creates a new island, and you know, that's part of the new identity of the place, and it gets put on the maps and it gets given a name, you know, and it's like, you know, gender reveal ceremony or something, but for new islands.
Volcanoes underwater, so then there's more land.
Like, I don't know how it works in terms of the science, but I mean, the thing about islands is that new islands, there's no confirmed number of islands on planet Earth, because they're constantly either going underwater or being born through whatever means. So it's like it's constantly shifting, which is like humans, you know. It's like identity.
Is that the way they phrase it in the literature as well? Islands being born.
I've definitely read it somewhere. Yeah. I mean, someone would have sort of written about it more.
That's really
more sort of scientifically, but I guess in Iceland, I think that's the way they see it, because they really ritualize it and they celebrate it like the arrival of a child, or a puppy. You know, it's great.
And I suppose if it's from a volcano, it feels maybe more generative than if it was just rock splitting off from other rock, and or kind of water levels changing. There's something much more kind of like an explosive birth moment.
It's very elemental. I think that's part of what I love about the Hebrides, is that you feel like you're in very close contact with base elements, because you can see the volcanic quality of the landscape. You can touch the what was once molten lava, and it's just like super dense and black, but also porous. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is spat out of a volcano, and it's not being like super eroded by the sea or the wind, and it's just so raw. Something about it is so raw. There's no embellishment. It's just like, it's like being in the periodic table or something, which I just love because it's not simple. It's actually one of the most complex things in the world, but it feels simple compared to the plasticized world culture that, I live in. Yeah.
I'm becoming conscious of time, but I have one more question that I'd love to ask. We've been on a crusade. No, not been on a crusade. Been on a bit of
between a quest and a crusade
on faff and the relationship between faff and flow, and also sort of the phenomenology of faff, if you will. But for me, at least, it seems to like precede any state of flow. Seems to be sort of essential to it. It isn't really talked about a lot. So, just wondering if you have a relationship with faff.
I have a relationship with procrastination, which I don't know if it somehow has faff-like elements to it.
What does it look like? As expected.
I think potentially I have a very organised faff. I don't know. This slightly contradicts because I think of faff as like kind of a chaotic. What even is faff? Faff, is it like a thing?
The sort of bit that's hard to define before you like do the actual thing.
I mean, I definitely have a relationship with faff. I feel like faff. I keep going back to procrastination because I feel like it's something that gets in the way of something else, but maybe it's actually part of the preparation. It's like you have to jump through the hoops before you're free from the hoops type of dynamic.
Maybe there's some senses in which it feels like not only a necessary precursor, but actually has a kind of creative interbleed with the stuff that goes on to be produced in the actual creative period that's been dedicated for it.
I think so. So this is very interesting to me because I have OCD and not extreme OCD, but I'm on the spectrum with it, and it doesn't really affect my daily life. Well, it does in its way, but it really affects my creativity, and I have to be really, in many ways, the common idea of OCD would be that it's anti-faff, and everything's like extremely methodical and organized, and linear and rigid and whatnot. And I try to control my existence through that means, and it doesn't work for my creativity. And I'm friends with lots of artists and writers who are sort of almost on the other end of the spectrum of ADHD, like super chaotic. Like, in fact, most of the people in my life are like this, which is a testament to the strength of our friendships, because often those people, they really like, but it works because I'm learning from them. I'm seeing the faff and the chaos and the just with the organized chaos kind of thing, and the ways in which they approach their creative acts. I'm thinking, well, it's really working for them. Their priorities are different around it. I don't know. I feel like priority is somehow coming into this, but I think there's something in it.
I may know where you're coming from. I have a bit of an objects and sort of tidiness thing that used to be really compulsive. But my faff would be like, I have to like tidy everything up and like make sure all the wires and all the cables are right before I like start a song. But that end up taking 45 minutes, and by the next day it's messy again. So that's like a version of faffing, but it's organization. I don't know if that's what you mean with sort of creativity and OCD and getting the conditions right.
Yeah, that is true. Actually, it's a form of, it's like organized faff.
Yeah.
Because I definitely do that. Like, I can't sit down in a room and write if I don't feel like there's feng shui. If I know there's another task, no matter how menial, that needs to be done, the priority goes sort of skew-if, because even though the writing is the priority, I'm like, I cannot possibly do it until I've, stereotype is like straightened this pencil or whatever. I mean, it's not that extreme, but I really am sort of plugged into all of the minutiae of my environment.
It's sometimes preferable, because I feel that way as well. I didn't always feel that way, but I feel that way now. If the task takes a bit longer than straightening a pencil, like if it turns out there's a few mugs that you could wash up that once you know about their existence, you can't not wash them up before you start writing, then at least that's kind of several more minutes before you have to start writing.
Yeah, it's like this overhang of obligation. It sort of sits in the back of the mind, and you're like, it's not even, the thing isn't important. And I, intellectually or emotionally or whatever, know that it's not important. It's not important at all.
Yeah.
And yet I put it on this thing, and I think it has something to do with the weight of obligation.
But I'm starting to wonder if that is kind of part of the ritual of getting into a flow state, that like that's a crucial part of it that gets kind of left behind or missed out. Not sure.
I wonder if, just sort of based on my own personal experience of like, to try and, like we were talking about earlier, create the conditions for the muse, I suppose, or, flow state, to either create in an environment, like basically go from one extreme to the other. So create an environment that's so chaotic that you give up and you don't faff, and you're like, right, none of this is, and you get down to it. Or create a completely minimalist, like, cave with a sheet of paper in it, and you're just stuck with, you're zoned in on something. But something that's in between is too nebulous and frustrating. Is you need to be in one end of extremes for it to sort of kickstart some sort of behaviour.
But then if you live in chaos, then you've got the faff of like looking for all the objects that you might want to.
Not always. That used to be my paradigm. I've kind of come out the other side. But when you live in chaos, you know exactly where everything is in the chaos, I find. And the problem is, if anyone else tries to help, then things are not where you left them. And I think the worst possible combination is someone living in chaos and someone who thinks they want to help. It's much, much better if it remains entirely undisturbed until you yourself change and can't bear it anymore, and then the faff commences.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's the kind of the mental faff as well, right? Of like, not the faff of your environment, but the inner faff of, well, I guess like overthinking or analysis or making stories or whatever.
Inner faff is a beautiful bit of terminology. Thank you.
Inner faff. yeah, like Yeah, sometimes even like superstitious in nature. Like, I'd like to listen to this song because that will get me in a particular mind state, and it's, or I mean, maybe not that, but
I know completely that, or just listen to it one more time, or maybe twice before it's time to do the thing.
Yeah, because you justify it for some reason, but then you don't pay attention to the reason you justified it.
Or to perceiving the effect in it that it was meant to have.
Yeah.
There's something really interesting about, how would I put it? Preparing yourself for the big event, the final event of the act of creation is just too much to behold. So you need to buffer or soften your landing or soften your entry somehow by faffing. Like, you imagine, you can't kind of, I hate to use this term, but you can't raw dog your creative act. Like, you can't just go in.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know what that means. Maybe don't look it up.
No, but I'm imagining.
It is what it says on the tin brick, basically. But you can't.
You know where it comes from, that term?
I have no idea. I just heard it and I was like, actually, even though it's kind of sexually explicit and quite crude, it works for a lot of situations. That you can't go straight into the encounter. It would shatter you to go straight into the creative act. You need the padding around it somehow. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's me justifying procrastination, basically.
But there's also a time like afterwards as well. Like if you've been immersed in something, like there's like a bridging out of that sort of back into this kind of sociable world. I find.
I don't tend to make it across that bridge, I don't think, very often.
It's like you're expanding and contracting your attention.
Yeah.
Basically, which is like, we can't sustain the levels of, like, today I was writing this funding application and I was like, I can't actually sustain this level of attention for this long, especially on a screen. And then immediately after I went and had a bath and I was like, it like quite literally like expanding from that sustains very precise form of attention.
Yeah. Sometimes if I have to do things that really require focus, especially like a little bit of creative thinking, like I have to go to the most chaotic place because then I can't distract myself mentally. If there are like environmental distractions, then it leaves me to just focus, like literally like go to the busiest like nightclub and like take my notepad and just start like, it's really interesting.
Because I suppose an environmental change and an activity like a bath, which is like a kind of sensory and environmental change, it's punctuation, it's putting something else between the previous thing and the next thing that just intercepts everything else that would be there, so that then the new thing can have center stage, or at least kind of coexist with other things that allow it to be.
And it's embodied as well.
And also, what happens when you're still not ready? Post faff, pre creative task or whatever it is. Quite often I've faffed for days, weeks, months, sometimes years on a particular thing, and I'm still not ready. And then I kind of, reverse psychology myself or whatever, or trick myself by saying, oh, basically fake it till you make it. You have just start pretending to do the task that you've been delaying, and then you naturally just fall into it. But it's very hard to do that, to even get to the first step of doing that. It's like,
I had to trick myself into writing my PhD, where it was like writing a PhD was like just too much to handle. So I would write things down, but almost like a word vomit, just like barely sentences, just like ideas, to do the reading, do the research, then just like the most horribly written like nonsense, and then edit it, and then edit it again, and then however many times that took. So I was just editing, or I was just like concept vomiting. So at no point was I writing the thing in my mind. It was just like like throwing mud at a wall and then tidying it up.
Where can our listeners find your Substack?
It's called, well, I think you can type in Hannah L. Close at substack.com, or go on to Substack. In the publication is called Metaxu, which is METAXU, which is a concept from Simone Weil, who's great.